Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're not talking emperors stabbing each other in the Senate. We're not talking Caesar crossing the Rubicon or gladiators yelling, "Are you not entertained?" No. Tonight, we're zooming way out of the spotlight. We're gliding past the marble statues and the golden laurel wreaths, and instead, we're poking around in the back alleys of Rome, the places where the statues don't shine and the senators don't strut. Because while emperors might have had their portraits carved into coins, someone else was cleaning up the coins before they got to market. And while gladiators were thrilling crowds at the Colosseum, someone else was sweeping up the blood, the sand, and, let's be honest, probably a few teeth. So, tonight's bedtime ramble is about the people whose jobs nobody brags about. The awkward, slightly gross, sometimes hilarious, and often strangely important jobs in ancient Rome. The ones history didn't exactly write on marble tablets, because apparently professional urine collector doesn't look as good in Latin. So dim the lights, settle in, and get comfortable, because in just a moment, you're about to meet the side characters of history. The people who kept Rome running, but who definitely never got a toga statue in their honor. Let's start with a fan favorite. And by fan favorite, I mean the job that makes every historian quietly smirk when they explain it in class. The now fullers were basically the ancient Roman dry cleaners, only, instead of starch and detergent, they used urine. Yes, actual human urine, and not just in tiny amounts. These people worked with vats of it. Imagine walking into a workshop and being hit with the smell of 50 buckets of stale pee just fermenting away. Not exactly the scent of victory. Here's how it worked. Romans discovered that urine, after sitting around for a while, produces ammonia. Ammonia is great at breaking down grease and dirt. So, to clean clothes, the fullers would soak them in urine, stomp on them with their feet, like a really gross winemaking process, and then rinse them out until they were passably fresh again. Passably being a generous word. The best part, the Roman government actually taxed urine collection. Emperor Vespasian introduced what was literally called the vectical urinae, the urine tax, and when people laughed at him for making money off bodily fluids, he famously held up a coin and said, "Pecunia non alet," money doesn't stink, which is ironic, because in this case, it definitely did. So, yes, being a fuller meant you got to spend your workday ankle-deep in communal pee, and you were technically providing an essential service. No emperor could parade in his purple toga unless somebody had stomped on it in a urine vat first. That's the real empire building right there. Now, if we drift a little further down Rome's career ladder, we find another gem of a job, professional mourners. Romans loved a good funeral. The bigger and more dramatic, the better. And if your family wasn't naturally dramatic enough, which honestly is hard to believe in ancient Rome, you could hire people to wail, sob, and throw themselves around in grief. Professional mourners were usually women. They'd cry loudly, tear at their hair, beat their chests, and make the whole scene look like the deceased was basically the most important Roman to ever exist. Even if he was just some random shopkeeper who sold olive oil. Sometimes they even brought musicians along, flutes, cymbals, and horns to make sure nobody within 3 blocks could miss the fact that Uncle Gaius had shuffled off this mortal coil. It was less quiet moment of reflection and more Broadway musical of grief. Of course, some wealthy Romans thought this was a bit much. Writers like Cicero rolled their eyes and complained that the whole thing was overdone. But that didn't stop it from happening. Because if there's one thing the Romans loved, it was competitive showing off, even in death. So, imagine being a professional mourner, waking up in the morning, stretching, and thinking, "Alright, I've got 3 funerals today. Better warm up the vocal cords," and then spending the whole afternoon howling dramatically at people you'd never even met. It wasn't glamorous, but hey, it paid the bills. Moving along, let's float over to a job that sounds like the setup for a bad joke, but was very, very real. The Aqueduct. These were the water carriers of Rome. Now, you might think, wait a second, didn't Rome have aqueducts? Giant engineering marvels that brought water into the city. Yes, they did. But unless you were rich enough to have water piped directly into your house, and let's be real, most people weren't, you still needed someone to lug buckets of water from public fountains to your door. That's where the Aqueduct came in. They were basically the ancient equivalent of water delivery guys. Only instead of a convenient 5-gallon jug that slips onto a cooler, they were schlepping amphorae of water upstairs, down alleys, and across crowded streets, day in, day out. And because this is Rome, of course there was corruption. Some equerry would sneak into aqueducts at night, siphon off extra water, and sell it under the table. Others might deliver less than what you paid for. So, imagine paying for your water, only to get home and find out your jug was half empty. The struggle was real, even in the empire. But the equerry were essential. Without them, no cooking, no washing, no bathing. And considering Roman baths were practically their social media, the place to see and be seen, water delivery was on just a chore. It was the backbone of daily life. And now, let's wander into a slightly stranger corner, a job that was both ridiculous and, in its own way, kind of dangerous. The animal keepers of the Colosseum. The Romans loved their games, gladiators of course, but also wild animal hunts, lions, leopards, elephants, crocodiles. If it could be dragged into an arena and made to fight or die spectacularly, the Romans wanted to see it, which meant somebody had to wrangle those animals. Enter the bestiarii. These weren't the gladiators themselves, but the people who managed, fed, and prepared the animals for shows. Imagine trying to keep a half-starved lion calm before its big debut, or trying to haul a rhinoceros through the streets of Rome without it wrecking half the neighborhood. Not exactly the safest of career choices. There are records of entire shipments of exotic animals dying en route, which probably made for some very awkward conversations. So, about that batch of 20 crocodiles you ordered. Funny story, for those that did survive, the bestiary had to keep them alive long enough to make it to the Colosseum, which often meant improvising cages, throwing in random food, and hoping for the best. If the lion didn't eat the goat, well, maybe tomorrow. And if the lion decided to eat the keeper instead, well, Rome had plenty of slaves to replace him. So, yes, a job that was equal parts zookeeper, stagehand, and possible lunch. Definitely not the kind of career you brag about at dinner parties. And since we're on the subject of Roman dinner parties, let's glide gently into one more unusual occupation before we wrap up this part. The vomitoria attendants. Now, to clear up a common myth, the term vomitorium didn't actually mean a special room for throwing up after eating too much. It referred to the passageways in stadiums where crowds spewed forth at the end of a show. But, and here's where it gets fun, Romans did sometimes vomit at feasts. Because nothing says good evening like binging, purging, and then going back for seconds. Some wealthy Romans even had slaves or attendants whose job was to help them with this process, holding bowls, cleaning up afterward, maybe even encouraging their masters to make room for more delicacies. Imagine spending your life as someone's personal bath manager, and all of this was considered perfectly acceptable. If you had enough money, why stop eating when you were full? Just reset the system and keep going. After all, the empire wasn't going to conquer itself on an empty stomach. So that's our first little drift through Rome's stranger job listings. From the peace stompers to the whalers for hire, from the water carriers to the lion wranglers, and yes, the unfortunate attendance of overeager party guests. Each one a reminder that history isn't just emperors and battles. It's also the people in the background, doing the awkward, smelly, thankless work that kept the machine running. The empire might have been built on marble and blood, but it was also built on buckets of urine, very loud funerals, and a whole lot of people who probably deserved hazard pay. Let's keep floating, because ancient Rome had plenty more of these side hustles. And in part 2, we'll meet some of the weirdest yet. Alright, welcome back. Hopefully by now you're cozy, maybe drifting just a little. Maybe still awake enough to picture yourself wandering the side streets of Rome, not the fancy marble ones. The ones with puddles, stray dogs, and a suspicious smell you can't quite place. Because in this part, we're diving deeper into the Roman job market. Jobs that ranged from mildly humiliating to downright gross. The kind of jobs where you don't exactly go home and brag about your career over a goblet of wine. Unless you want people to scoot a little further away from you at the dinner table. So, let's start with a job that is as old as human civilization itself. The night soil collectors. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. These were the men who emptied chamber pots, cleaned out cesspits, and made sure the streets didn't become one giant open sewer. And in Rome, where 1 million people were crammed together, you can imagine the scale of the problem. Now, Rome did have public latrines, big, communal spaces where you'd sit shoulder to shoulder with your fellow citizens, doing your business while chatting about politics. bread prices, or whatever scandal was in the Senate that week. But even those latrines had to be cleaned, and the pipes and drains had to be cleared, which meant someone had to go in, shovel things out, and cart them away. It was dangerous work, too, not just disgusting. Ancient sewers could fill with toxic gases. There are stories of workers collapsing and dying underground because of fumes. So yes, imagine explaining that on your tombstone. Here lies Marcus. He suffocated in a sewer, not the most glamorous legacy, and yet the job was essential. Without them, Rome would have drowned in its own waste, quite literally. So, while nobody toasted the night soil collectors, the city depended on them every single day. Moving gently along, let's slide into something a little less deadly, but no less undignified. The lamp cleaners. Rome was full of oil lamps. Homes, streets, temples, baths. Anywhere you needed light, you had a little clay lamp burning olive oil. And those things got messy. They smoked, they got clogged, they sputtered, and somebody had to go around trimming the wicks, refilling the oil, and scraping off the black soot. Now, wealthy Romans could afford slaves to do this in their villas, but in public spaces, like the giant baths, you needed actual staff. Imagine being the person whose full-time job was to make sure hundreds of lamps stayed lit, clean, and not on fire. Kind of the ancient equivalent of a janitor meets electrician. It wasn't glamorous, but again, it was crucial. Without lamp cleaners, your evening bath at the Thermae would have been spent in the dark, bumping into strangers, and possibly stepping in things you'd rather not. Next, let's drift over to another odd one. A job that was half practical, half ceremonial. The corpse handlers. Romans had very particular rituals about death. The elite got fancy funerals, sometimes with those professional mourners we mentioned earlier. But most people, while someone had to pick up the bodies, especially of the poor, the enslaved, or those who died without family. Enter the corpse handlers. They were often hired by the state or temples to collect bodies, transport them outside the city walls, because Romans didn't allow burials inside the city, and deposit them in communal graves. The famous puticuli were basically massive pits, where the poor were dumped en masse. The job carried a social stigma. Touching dead bodies was seen as polluting, so corpse handlers were looked down on, avoided, maybe even treated as cursed. Which is pretty ironic, because without them, the city would have turned into one big plague factory. So once again, the people nobody wanted to sit next to at dinner were quietly saving everyone else from disease. History has a funny way of working like that. Now, let's pause on something a little lighter. Because Rome wasn't all sewage and corpses. Sometimes the jobs were just weird, like the scribes for hire. Most Romans weren't literate. They could maybe recognize a name, or a few letters, but writing a full letter, that was a luxury skill. So, if you wanted to send a message, you went to a street corner where scribes sat at little desks, ready to write whatever you needed. It could be a love letter, a business contract, a complaint to the local magistrate. The scribe would carefully write it out on a wax tablet, or a piece of papyrus. And then you'd carry it off, looking very sophisticated, as if you'd written it yourself. The funniest part, there are surviving wax tablets where we can actually see people dictating awkwardly, and scribes trying to keep up. Imagine someone saying, "Tell her I miss her, but don't make it sound too desperate," and the scribe, deadpan, writes, "He misses you desperately." Not exactly the wingman you were hoping for, but the scribes were crucial. They were the middlemen of communication. Without them, half the business of Rome would have ground to a halt. Let's slide into something more entertaining. The performers who weren't quite actors. See, Rome loved theater, comedies, tragedies, mimes. But there was a whole subcategory of performers who had very niche jobs, like funeral clowns. Yes, actual clowns at funerals. Sometimes, wealthy families would hire someone to wear a mask of the dead person and act out their mannerisms during the funeral procession. Kind of like a parody tribute. It was supposed to be funny, but also a way of remembering them. Imagine someone at your funeral doing an exaggerated impression of how you always complained about the price of bread. That's the vibe. It sounds bizarre to us, but to Romans, it was just part of the spectacle. Life, death, and comedy all blurred together. And for the funeral clowns themselves, well, it was a living. Not the most dignified, but probably more fun than cleaning sewers. And speaking of indignities, let's float over to one of the strangest gigs of all, the toga straighteners. Togas were a nightmare. Huge lengths of fabric, carefully draped and folded, with no pins or seams. They had to look just right, especially if you were a senator or a magistrate. One wrong fold and suddenly you looked less like a dignified Roman and more like Yudi rolled out of bed, tangled in your bedsheet. So, there were people whose whole job was to help you put on your toga, adjust it, and keep it in place during public appearances. Imagine being the personal stylist whose career was devoted entirely to making sure fabric didn't T-slide off a sweaty politician in the forum. It was a behind-the-scenes role, but incredibly important. Because in Rome, appearance was everything, and you couldn't give a fiery speech about the glory of the Republic if your toga was slipping off your shoulder like a bath towel. Before we drift toward the end of this part, let's not forget one last, delightfully gross career path: the collectors of animal dung. Rome had animals everywhere: horses, donkeys, cattle, sheep, and with animals comes, well, a lot of manure. Someone had to clean it up. But actually, it wasn't just waste. Dung was valuable. It could be used as fertilizer or even as a fuel source in poorer households. So there were people who went around collecting it, piling it up, and selling it. Which meant, yes, there were literal poop merchants in ancient Rome. Probably not the most glamorous stall in the marketplace. But hey, farmers needed it. And once again, we circled back to that theme. Rome ran on the unglamorous jobs. The empire was built not just on legions and senators, but on people shoveling animal waste, adjusting togas, and trimming lampwicks. So, as we wrap this drift, let's remember, ancient Rome was not just marble temples and golden laurel crowns. It was also the people who kept the whole messy, smelly, chaotic machine turning. The corpse handlers, the dung collectors, the scribes hunched over wax tablets, the lamp cleaners making sure the baths didn't go dark, the funeral clowns doing bad impressions of Uncle Gaius, all of them forgotten by the big history books, but absolutely essential in their own odd ways. Let's keep floating into part 3, where we'll find even more of these strange behind-the-scenes jobs, the ones that remind us Rome was less glorious empire and more giant, very messy city, full of awkward careers. So, let's float gently into another corner of Roman labor. The kind of work that makes you wonder if anyone ever actually wanted to live in that empire, or if people just tolerated it out of habit. Because Rome had a little thing called spectacle: gladiator fights, chariot races, beast hunts, public executions. Basically, their entertainment options ranged somewhere between morbid and horrifyingly creative. And behind every bloody afternoon at the Colosseum, there were workers, the invisible crew, the ones with the strangest, least dignified jobs imaginable. Let's start with the beast wranglers. The Romans adored importing exotic animals for the arena: lions from Africa, crocodiles from the Nile, leopards, elephants, even hippos. Because, of course, nothing says civilized empire like throwing a zebra into an amphitheater just to watch it get mauled. Now, you might think the hardest part of this job was surviving the animals, but in truth, the logistics were almost worse. Imagine trying to keep a half-starved lion alive after weeks on a ship, or trying to persuade an elephant, fresh off a stressful boat ride, to politely enter a dark holding cell until showtime. The handlers, called bestiarii, if they also fought the beasts, spent their days herding stressed, angry, very confused animals into cages, and sometimes those cages broke, which made the Colosseum not just a theater, but also the world's most dangerous workplace. And after the show ended, somebody had to clean up. Which brings us to arena cleaners. Their official job title doesn't survive, but their work was clear enough: sweeping sand, dragging corpses, removing shredded remains of both gladiators and animals. You can picture them trudging in with rakes and buckets, while the crowd filed out, still buzzing about their favorite kill of the afternoon. It's the Roman equivalent of being the guy who has to mop up after a rock concert, except with less beer and more lion entrails. Oh, and here's a particularly charming detail: the sand itself was sometimes replaced between shows. Why? Because it was soaked in blood, and you couldn't exactly reuse yesterday's gore-soaked gravel for next week's festival. So workers carted it out in heaps, like ancient sanitation engineers, only their garbage bags were dripping red. Now, if the arena wasn't enough for you, there were also the executioners of Rome. Not a glamorous job, despite what Hollywood would like you to think. These weren't noble masked figures, swinging axes in front of dramatic crowds. More often, They were low-ranking slaves or freedmen told to do the dirty work of strangling prisoners, burning them, or crucifying them on the roadside. Imagine having professional crucifier as your day job. It's the sort of line you probably didn't bring up at dinner parties, unless you were trying to end the conversation quickly. And just to round things out, let's not forget the flesh inspectors. Yes, this was a real Roman job. Essentially, market officials who checked the meat being sold to ensure it wasn't spoiled. Which sounds good in theory, nobody wants rotten lamb chops. But in practice, it meant poking, sniffing, and sometimes even tasting questionable cuts of beef, in an era when refrigeration was not exactly a thing. You'd think the gladiator arena was bad, until you remember that somewhere, in a Roman marketplace, a guy was gnawing on a suspicious sausage for the sake of public health. So, between wrangling angry leopards, hauling gore-soaked sand, and sampling rancid goat meat, the Roman labor force was doing some real heavy lifting. Not exactly the glamorous marble column world of Hollywood Rome, but definitely the reality under the sandals. And because Rome always loved doubling down on unpleasantness, let's drift into another kind of job, a quieter one, but no less strange. The people who spent their lives managing urine. Yes, we're going there. So, here's something nobody tells you in school. In ancient Rome, urine was not just waste, it was an industry. And some unlucky souls had jobs built entirely around collecting, hauling, and using it. Why? Well, urine contains ammonia, which is great for cleaning and bleaching. The Romans, ever practical, decided it would be a shame to let all that golden liquid go to waste, so they turned it into a resource. Public urinal stone jars placed on streets were set up for people to contribute, and then along came the workers whose job was to collect it. They were called philones or phtos. Their main job was cleaning cloth. Imagine walking into a laundry where instead of detergent, people are stomping around in vats of stale urine, because that's literally what happened. Workers soaked wool in it, and then stomped on it with their bare feet to clean out the oils and dirt. Kind of like making wine, but in the worst way possible. It was sweaty, smelly, and endless. A fuller might spend hours a day wading in the stuff, with little ventilation and no gloves. And just in case the aroma wasn't pungent enough, the cloth then had to be rinsed with sulfur and dried. Laundry day in Rome was basically a hazmat event, disguised as industry. Now, Rome being Rome, of course the government decided to tax it. The Emperor Vespasian, who had a knack for squeezing money out of anything, introduced what was literally called the urine tax. Collectors had to pay for the right to gather it, and then they sold it on to fullers and tanners. When Vespasian's son Titus complained that the whole thing was disgusting, Vespasian held up a coin from the tax and said, "Money doesn't stink." The Romans loved this line so much, it became a proverb. So yes, Rome built an economy on pee, and somewhere out there were workers whose entire livelihood was ferrying jars of it through city streets, probably trying not to spill. Imagine being that guy on a hot Mediterranean afternoon, sloshing your way to the laundry. Not exactly a glamorous Roman career. And urine wasn't just for laundry. Tanners who worked with animal hides also needed it. Their job was already unpleasant, soaking skins in vats, scraping off flesh, stretching them, and trying to make them less revolting before turning them into leather. Urine softened the hides, making them easier to treat, which meant tanners like fullers also lived in a permanent cloud of ammonia. Where did they work? Usually on the edges of cities, because even ancient Romans didn't want to live next door to that smell. It's one thing to have gladiator corpses dragged past your apartment. It's another to live uphill from a urine-soaked tannery in the middle of summer. So here's the big picture. On one side of Rome, marble senators were debating philosophy. On the other, grimy men were stomping around in human waste for a living. Same empire, two realities. And they coexisted for centuries. And if you thought that was the low point of Roman jobs, oh, we're just getting warmed up. Because next up we're going to drift into another corner of the labor market. One that was technically religious, but also bizarrely specific. Let's meet the people who spent their lives managing sacred chickens, cutting up livers, and whispering omens to nervous generals. So, in Rome, religion wasn't exactly about faith in the modern sense. It was more about contracts with the gods. You do the ritual correctly, the gods stay happy, and the empire keeps running. But the rituals required a whole army of specialists. Some of them had important sounding titles, while others, while their jobs were basically bird babysitters. Let's start with the Pularetha men in charge of Rome's sacred chickens. Yes, that was an actual career path. These chickens weren't ordinary barnyard animals, they were divine tools. Roman generals carried them on campaign, inside little cages, and consulted them before major battles. Here's how it worked. Before going into combat, the Polarius would open the cage and scatter grain. If the chickens ate greedily, pecking with enthusiasm, that meant the gods approved. If they refused to eat, or heaven forbid wandered off, that was a very bad sign. The fate of entire armies sometimes hinged on whether a chicken felt snacky. Now, you might think this was an occasional ritual, but no. These chickens had to be looked after constantly. Fed, watered, cleaned, transported. Imagine trudging through Gaul or trudging across North Africa with cages of cranky divine poultry. That was the Polaris's life. He was part priest, part chicken wrangler, part logistics officer. And of course, not every general appreciated when the chickens gave bad news. There's a famous case with the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher during the First Punic War. He asked his sacred chickens if they approved of his naval battle. They refused to eat. Instead of listening, he threw them into the sea and declared, "If they won't eat, let them drink." Spoiler, his fleet was destroyed. Maybe the chickens were onto something, but the Pulleri weren't alone. They were part of a whole ecosystem of omen readers, which brings us to the Augurs. These were men whose official job was to interpret the will of the gods by studying signs. And by signs, I mean anything from the flight patterns of birds to the direction of thunder. The Augurs wore special outfits, carried a crooked staff called a lichuis, and basically stood around watching the sky. Did a bird fly left? Bad omen. Did lightning strike to the right? Good omen. Rome's entire political machine sometimes ground to a halt because an augur declared the omens weren't favorable for holding a vote. Sounds boring, right? But being an augur was actually a high-status gig. Senators fought over those positions, because whoever controlled the omens could stall a rival's career or push through their own agenda. If the bird said no, then sorry, you weren't passing that law today. And then there were the haruspices, perhaps the weirdest of all. Their specialty, reading the future in animal entrails. Before battles or major events, they would sacrifice an animal, usually a sheep, and then examine its liver. Yes, the liver was considered the seat of divine messages. Imagine that as your day job. You wake up, put on your work clothes, and your task list is 1. Kill sheep. 2. Stare at its liver. 3. Tell a nervous general that the blob on the left means the gods are fine with his invasion plan. That was the career path of a haruspex, and Rome really trusted these guys. Generals and emperors didn't want to move a muscle without someone telling them whether the gods were on board. Of course, it was a job with some performance pressure. If your interpretation went wrong and the campaign failed, people remembered. Together, these omen specialists created a whole job sector built around keeping Rome's leaders calm, or at least giving them an excuse when things went wrong. Some were highly respected, others mocked, but all of them got paid to either wrangle chickens, stare at clouds, or dig through sheep guts. So, on one end of Roman society, we have senators and emperors making grand speeches about empire, and right behind them, some guy is shaking grain at a chicken, waiting for it to nod along. That's Rome in a nutshell. Marble temples up front, poultry cages in the back. And speaking of marble temples, not all Roman religious jobs were about reading signs. Some were about caretaking. Let us float next into the lives of the Vestal Virgins women, whose entire existence was dedicated to guarding a sacred fire and not breaking a very strict rule. So, picture this. You're a young girl in ancient Rome, maybe 6 or 7 years old. One day, men in official robes show up at your family's house. Congratulations, you've been chosen for one of the highest honors a Roman woman could possibly achieve. No, you're not marrying into power. No, you're not inheriting land. Instead, you get to spend the next 30 years guarding a sacred fire. These were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta. Their one big responsibility, keeping the eternal flame in her temple burning. If it went out, the Romans believed disaster would follow. In other words, they were the spiritual babysitters of a fire that absolutely could not go out, ever. Now, the job came with perks. The Vestals were chosen from elite families, and once inducted, they were freed from the control of their fathers, which, in patriarchal Rome, was no small thing. They lived together in a special house near the forum. They had seats of honor at games, and they were treated with deep respect. People even made way for them in the streets, which was rare in a city where shoving was practically a civic duty. But the job also came with rules. The biggest absolute, lifelong chastity. They had to remain virgins for their entire 30-year service. If they broke that vow, the punishment wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was being buried alive. Yes, Rome had a whole ritual for this, because spilling a Vestal's blood was forbidden. The state dug a small underground chamber, gave her a bit of food and water, and sealed her inside. Officially, this wasn't execution. It was just removal, a very Roman loophole, and it happened. Not often, but enough that the Romans clearly enjoyed a little scandal. Several Vestals were accused over the centuries. Some were acquitted after dramatic trials. Others weren't so lucky. It's hard not to imagine that at least a few were simply caught up in political rivalries after all. Accusing a Vestal virgin was a great way to stir the pot. But let's not forget the day-to-day reality. Most of the time, being a Vestal wasn't about scandals or burials. It was about fire maintenance, making sure the sacred flame never went out, tending it, watching it, and occasionally performing rituals connected to it. A lifetime of staring into a hearth, basically. Still, the role carried a kind of mystical power. Vestals could grant pardons. Prisoners who managed to touch their robes might be spared. They also had special privileges in court. So while most Roman women were legally bound to male guardians, Vestals were floating in this rarefied zone of independence. It was a weird mix of empowerment and entrapment, and when their 30 years were up, well, technically, they were free to marry, but most didn't. Imagine trying to rejoin normal Roman society after 3 decades of cloistered firekeeping. Plus, many Romans thought marrying a former Vestal was bad luck, so most of them lived out their lives with pensions provided by the state, quietly fading into the background. In short, the Vestal virgins lived at the heart of Rome, but in many ways, apart from it, revered, restricted, respected, and occasionally buried alive. It was a job that could make you a symbol of purity, or a scapegoat for Rome's bad days. Now, if guarding fire sounds like a strange career path, Rome had plenty more where that came from. Next, let us drift over to the men who made a living as professional mourners, people literally paid to cry at funerals. Because in Rome, even grief was outsourced. Imagine this, someone important in your family dies. You want the funeral to look impressive. You want the neighbors to know this wasn't just any ordinary Roman. But here's the problem. Your family isn't particularly emotional. Maybe you're more of the stoic type. Maybe you don't have many relatives left. Or maybe you just don't feel like putting in the effort. That's where the praefectae came in. These were women, usually, who made their living by showing up to funerals and crying very loudly. Not just gentle sobbing, either. We're talking wailing, shrieking, tearing at their hair, beating their chests, sometimes even scratching their faces until they bled. All on cue. All for a fee. It was like ancient Rome's version of Yelp reviews for funerals. The more dramatic the cries, the more respectable the deceased must have been. If no one wailed, well, maybe the person wasn't loved. But if the whole street echoed with screams, clearly this was a loss of great magnitude. And of course, because Rome never did anything halfway, the mourners didn't stop at crying. They also performed dances, sometimes in groups, circling the body as they shouted praises or laments. In some cases, they carried wax masks of the dead person's ancestors, because nothing says moving send-off like a parade of ghostly faces from your family line. The richer the family, the bigger the spectacle. Funeral processions could stretch across the streets with musicians, actors, torchbearers, and, yes, armies of professional criers. It was grief as performance, with the audience being the entire city. Now, here's the irony. Roman writers loved to mock this. Authors like Seneca and Juvenal complained that it was fake, tacky, and yet, it kept happening. Why? Because no one wanted their loved one to look unpopular. Better to hire some strangers to wail than risk looking like your family didn't care. And sometimes, the mourners were asked to pivot mid-performance. Crying was the default, but if the deceased had been particularly disliked, mourners might switch into mocking or scornful songs. Imagine paying someone to roast your dead uncle while his ashes cooled nearby. Romans loved a bit of theatrical honesty, but the mourners weren't just spectacle. there was also something deeper here. Romans believed that loud, public grief helped guide the soul of the dead into the afterlife. So while the praefectae might have looked like hired actresses, their role had spiritual weight. Without them, some Romans feared the dead might not rest peacefully. Still, it was a tough job. You had to cry on demand, sometimes for hours, in all weather. You risked being trampled in crowded funeral parades, and you were paid not that much. The job carried little honor. These weren't elite priestesses. They were working women, often poor, sometimes enslaved. Their voices filled the streets, but their own lives were mostly invisible. And here's the sleepy little irony. For all the noise, the mourners themselves vanished quietly from history. We know they existed. We can picture them screaming in the streets of Rome, but not a single one is named in the surviving sources. Eternal anonymity for the people who once made grief deafening. Now, funerals weren't the only Roman event with hired performers. If mourners made a career of crying, there were others who made their living with fire, blood, or even sewers. And since our night is still young, let's float from the echoing funerals out into the rank, damp tunnels of Rome's underworld to meet the men who cleaned the Cloaca Maxima, the city's massive sewer. If you've ever complained about your job, just remember, at least you weren't one of the men cleaning the Cloaca Maxima. The Cloaca Maxima was Rome's giant central sewer system, and in its own way, it was an engineering marvel. Built originally in the 6th century BCE, when kings still ruled the city, it was basically a massive stone tunnel designed to drain the swampy valleys between Rome's hills. Over time, it evolved into the artery of the city's entire waste system. Rainwater, animal waste, household garbage, and, of course, human waste all flowed through it, straight into the Tiber River. Now, here's the thing. Romans loved their baths. They loved their fountains. They loved their constant access to running water, which meant they also produced a staggering amount of sewage, and all of it had to go somewhere. So who dealt with it? Well, the Cloaca Maxima wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a network, tunnels big enough for men to walk through, which means someone had to walk through them. Enter the foricari, the sewer workers. Imagine descending into pitch-dark tunnels with only a flickering oil lamp, wading ankle or knee-deep through a slurry of filth, mud, and whatever your fellow Romans had decided to toss down their drains that week. Animal carcasses, rotten food, and yes, more human waste than you'd ever care to think about. The job was dangerous. Tunnels could collapse. Poisonous gases built up in enclosed spaces. There were stories, probably exaggerated, but still, of workers being attacked by rats, or even crocodiles that had somehow wandered up the waterways. Realistically, suffocation from methane was a bigger risk than reptiles, but you can see why rumors spread. And yet, these workers were essential. Without them, Rome would have drowned in its own filth. Even emperors recognized their importance. Augustus himself reportedly inspected the sewers, though let's be honest, he probably did not get his sandals dirty. The irony here is that while the foricari did the dirtiest, most degrading work imaginable, the Romans didn't exactly shower them in gratitude. They were associated with impurity. No one wanted to sit next to them at dinner. And yet, the city literally could not function without them. Classic Rome. Celebrate the aqueducts. Ignore the people who shovel what comes out the other end. But here's where it gets a little more poetic. The Cloaca Maxima was more than just plumbing. For the Romans, it had a kind of sacred aura. They built shrines near its outlets, even dedicated parts of it to the goddess Clecina. Yes, the literal goddess of the sewer. People left offerings there, because in Rome, even a drain could have divine power. So picture this. Deep underground workers shuffle through the muck, scraping waste off the walls, keeping the flow moving. Above them, life in the city buzzes on markets, temples, banquets. The elite write poetry about fountains and marble baths. And below, half-forgotten men keep the whole show from collapsing. A job disgusting, dangerous, and absolutely vital. And one more example of how Rome's greatness rested quietly and stinkily on the backs of invisible laborers. Let's rinse that image from our minds now, climb back into the sunlight, and wander to another Roman career that's less filthy but just as peculiar. This time, not underground, but center stage. Let us drift into the world of arena workers, the men who set the scene for gladiators, wrangled wild animals, and sometimes ended up as accidental performers themselves. When you think of the Colosseum, You probably imagine gladiators in shiny helmets, lions prowling the sand, emperors giving thumbs up or down. That's the show. But what about the people who made sure the show could even happen? Enter the arenary, the arena workers. These were the men, often slaves or very low-status laborers, who turned the Colosseum into a functioning machine of blood, sand, and drama. Their first and most basic job was in their name, the sand. Arena literally means sand, and that's because the floor of the Colosseum was always covered with a layer of it. Why? To soak up blood and sweat and whatever else spilled during the games. Arena workers had to rake, shovel, and smooth it constantly, replacing stained sand with fresh piles so that everything looked presentable. Nothing ruins an epic fight like slipping in yesterday's gore, but sand duty was just the start. The Colosseum was essentially an ancient stage with trapdoors, pulleys, and elevators. Yes, elevators. Beneath the floor, there was a whole underground labyrinth. The hypogeum, where animals, props, and sometimes gladiators were stored until it was their moment. Arena workers ran that system. Imagine trying to keep track of dozens of cages, pulleys, and platforms, all while a crowd of 50,000 people was waiting above for the next spectacle. One wrong lever pull, and instead of a lion, you send up a confused goat. And then there were the animals themselves. Rome loved exotic beasts, leopards, elephants, rhinos, ostriches, bears. They were shipped in from across the empire, often half-starved and terrified, who had to wrangle them into cages, drag them underground, and somehow get them to appear in the arena on cue. The arena workers, some were specialists, almost like ancient zookeepers, but without any of the training or safety equipment you'd expect today. If an animal got loose in the tunnels, and sometimes they did, it wasn't T, the emperor, who had to chase it down. It was some unlucky slave with a rope and a stick. And of course, accidents happened. There are accounts of workers being mauled while trying to prepare beasts, or crushed under stage machinery. Their deaths didn't count as part of the show, but the audience might hear about it later as a darkly amusing side note. There were also the stagehands of death. Sometimes, elaborate scenery was set up. Artificial forests, mock mountains, even miniature naval battles with flooded floors. Who set all that up? Arena crews, working all night, hauling props, hammering wood, and praying nothing collapsed mid-fight. Now, here's a detail most people don't think about. Someone had to clean up after executions. Bodies of criminals, martyrs, or unlucky gladiators didn't just disappear. Workers had to drag them off with hooks, dump them out of sight, and then quietly reset the stage. Talk about thankless labor. Despite all this, arena workers rarely got recognition. They weren't named in records. No triumphal arches were built for them. They were shadows making the spectacle possible. And yet, without them, the Colosseum would have been a disaster, a muddy pit of chaos instead of the smooth-running machine of entertainment Rome bragged about. And, because Rome loved a bit of cosmic irony, some arena workers ended up as performers anyway. If an emperor was feeling especially cruel, he might toss some of them into the arena to face wild beasts themselves. One day you're sweeping sand, the next day you are the entertainment. Job security was flexible, so next time you picture the roar of the Colosseum, remember the quiet crew below, sweeping, hauling, sweating, trying not to be eaten by a panther before lunch. The invisible backbone of Rome's favorite blood-soaked pastime. Now, since we're lingering in the Colosseum, let's not climb out just yet, because alongside the fighters and the workers, there were also the vendors, the people selling food, souvenirs, and questionable snacks to the crowd. Let us float up into the stands and see what Romans munched on while watching someone get disemboweled. So, you're sitting in the Colosseum. The sun is blazing, the air smells like sweat, dust, and the faint metallic temps of blood. You've been there for hours. The morning executions are done, the gladiators are warming up, and the lions are pacing underground. You get hungry. What do? You call the vendors. Yes, Rome had them. Just like a baseball game today, the Colosseum was full of people wandering the stands, selling food and drinks to spectators who couldn't be bothered to get up from their seats. The most popular snack, bread, always bread. Romans ate it constantly, and arena vendors sold simple loaves, flatbreads, and rolls that could be carried in your hand while you shouted insults at a gladiator. If you were fancy, you might get bread dipped in olive oil or sprinkled with herbs. If you were broke, You probably just chewed on a stale crust and pretended it was fine. Next up, olives and nuts. Easy to carry, easy to toss into your mouth between fights. Archaeologists have actually found nutshells and olive pits in the drainage system of the Colosseum. Proof that fans were basically littering like modern sports crowds. Imagine the janitors at the end of the day, sweeping up blood-soaked sand mixed with half-eaten peanuts. Delightful. And yes, there was meat. Street vendors outside the arena sold grilled sausages and skewers, which you could buy and bring in. Nothing says a fun day out like gnawing on a hot sausage while a tiger dismembers a criminal in front of you. The contrast is peak Roman. Drinks? Oh, there were drinks. The cheap option was water. A step up was posca, the Roman version of budget soda, basically vinegar diluted with water, sometimes flavored with herbs, refreshing in a sour, my teeth hurt now kind of way. The wealthy might sip watered-down wine, because even in the middle of a bloody spectacle, you had to maintain your dignity. And then there were souvenirs. Yes, vendors sold little trinkets too. Oil lamps, stamped with gladiators, cheap figurines, maybe even scraps of cloth, dyed to look like your favorite fighter's colors. Imagine being a die-hard fan of Gladiator Steve and buying his merch, then watching him get skewered 10 minutes later. Collectibles didn't age well. The smell though, that's the part modern people forget. Thousands of bodies packed together, the heat, the animals below, often kept without proper cleaning. Add in spilled wine, roasted meat, vinegar drinks, and, well, the Colosseum must have reeked. Spectators didn't mind, of course. They were used to city stench. But still, it wasn't exactly a pleasant stadium hot dog aroma. More like rotten olive pit mixed with lion urine. Vendors were usually free poor citizens, or sometimes slaves hired out by their masters. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. Rome loved its games, and where there's a crowd, there's money. Some vendors made a decent living hustling snacks to 50,000 people in a single day. Of course, competition was fierce. Imagine two sausage sellers shouting over each other while the crowd yells for blood. Fresh pork here. No, mine's cheaper. Meanwhile, a gladiator's arm just got chopped off. And nobody's even looking at the stage because they're trying to decide between nuts or olives. So yes, the Colosseum wasn't just death and drama. It was also a massive food court. People didn't just come for the fights. They came for the socializing, the eating, the drinking, and the spectacle. If the show was boring, at least you had snacks. Now that we've stuffed ourselves, let us drift back down into the bowels of Roman entertainment again. Not the Colosseum this time, but the world of public baths. Because guess what? Even there, behind all the steam and chatter, were strange little jobs that kept Roman leisure running. The Roman baths, they weren't just about getting clean. They were a mix of spa, gym, cafe, and gossip hub. Everyone went from senators to slaves, because hygiene was only half the excuse. The real reason, networking, relaxing, and showing off. And like all big social spaces, the baths created plenty of strange jobs. The first one worth mentioning is the strigil guy. What's a strigil? It's a curved metal tool shaped like a looped blade, and it was used to scrape off sweat, oil, and dirt from the skin. Think of it as an ancient squeegee for your body. You couldn't just hop under a hot shower, because Rome didn't really do soap the way we do. Instead, you slathered yourself in oil, worked up a sweat in the warm rooms, and then had a slave or an attendant scrape the whole mess off with a strigil. The result, smooth, shiny, and probably still smelling faintly like olive oil. Now, some rich people had private attendants, personal strigil bearers who carried the oil flasks, rubbed them on your back, and then scraped you down. But in the big public baths, there were bathhouse workers who offered the service for a fee. They stood ready with jars of oil, little bronze bottles called ereboloi, and their trusty scrapers. If you were cheap, you did it yourself. If you had a few extra coins, you paid someone to do it for you. It wasn't glamorous. Imagine scraping greasy strangers all day long, rubbing oil into their shoulders while they gossip about politics. You didn't even get the dignity of a title. You were just one of the bath attendants. And then there were the soapmen, sort of. Romans didn't use soap bars like we do, but there were people who sold various cleaning agents on the side. Ash, mixed with fat, crushed herbs, even chalk powders for whitening the skin. Think of them as proto-spa product salesmen, always hovering, always ready to upsell. Another vital role, towel slaves. In the bigger baths, some attendants handed out towels or cloths. Not plush spa towels, mind you, just thin linen that probably did more smearing than drying. But hey, it was better than nothing. Wealthy bathgoers brought their own towels, usually carried by household slaves. And then there's the truly humble job, sponge duty. Romans used sponges for just about everything, wiping benches, cleaning the floors, even functioning as the infamous sponger, the communal sponginistic used in toilets. Bath attendants had to keep the washing areas tidy, which meant lots of sponge work. Picture scrubbing down slippery marble all day, surrounded by sweaty strangers, for very little pay. Not exactly a dream career. Let's not forget the firestokers, the guys working behind the scenes in the hypercost, the underfloor heating system. Roman baths had ingenious heating, with furnaces burning constantly to heat water and pump warm air under the floors and through the walls. But someone had to keep those fires alive, shovel in the wood, and clean out the ash. The firemen of the baths lived in the worst heat, smoke, and filth, while the wealthy sat above them in clouds of scented steam. If you ever wonder who had the worst job in Roman leisure, the furnace stokers are near the top. And of course, you had masseurs. Yes, massages were a thing, not always the relaxing spa kind. Sometimes rough, vigorous rubbing meant to loosen muscles after exercise. Bathhouses had workers skilled in kneading sore arms, cracking backs, and stretching joints. It wasn't exactly high medicine, but it felt luxurious after a session in the hot room. But the most overlooked job might be the gossip spreader. Not an official position, but in practice, many bath attendants doubled as informants. They overheard conversations, senators muttering about policy, generals bragging about campaigns, aristocrats complaining about rivals, and like any service worker close to the elite, they passed the gossip along for coin. In a city as political as Rome, the bathhouse staff weren't just scraping oil, they were little intelligence agents, whether they meant to be or not. So, the Roman baths weren't just marble halls of relaxation, they were workplaces for dozens of nameless attendants, scraping, scrubbing, stoking, and serving so that the wealthy could recline in luxury. And since we've now been oiled, scraped, and steamed, let's step out of the bathhouse and wander the Roman streets again. Because while all of this leisure looked glamorous, someone had to keep the city itself from collapsing into filth. That's right, it's time to meet the urban maintenance workers of Rome. Rome, sprawling, noisy, and bustling, wasn't magically clean. The streets were crowded with pedestrians, carts, animals, and vendors, hawking everything from olives to sandals. And naturally, all of that activity produced waste, lots of it. So someone had to deal with it. Enter the street cleaners and sewage workers, the unsung heroes keeping Rome from becoming one giant, rotting mess. First, let's talk about the sewer side. We've already dipped a toe into the Cloaca Maxima, but Rome's sanitation system extended far beyond the central sewer. Private homes often had drains leading to small channels in the streets. These carried water, household runoff, and waste to the main sewers. But these channels could easily clog. Rats, debris, and let's be honest, the occasional half-eaten loaf of bread made things sticky. Someone had to crawl in with hooks, rods, and brooms to keep things flowing. That someone was usually a low-status laborer, sometimes a slave, sometimes a contracted worker. It was dirty, smelly, and dangerous. Methane gas, collapsing channels, and occasional surprises were part of the job. Then there were street sweepers. The main roads, like the Via Sacra or the Forum, were constantly used by citizens and merchants. And without anyone tidying up, they'd be littered with mud, manure, broken pottery, and the remnants of yesterday's market. Sweepers carried brooms made of twigs or straw, scoops, and baskets. Their job was to keep traffic moving and prevent public disease outbreaks. Not glamorous, but essential. And unlike our modern street cleaners, they had to contend with animal droppings from horses, donkeys, and the occasional elephant paraded through town for a festival. Now, in wealthy districts, there might be paid attendants for private roads or courtyards, but for the majority of the city, public street cleaning was labor-intensive and underpaid. Workers often had to wake early, work through dust, heat, and the stench of city life, and face the occasional rude passerby. We might look at them and think of hygiene, but Romans probably saw them as just part of the backdrop, as invisible as the stone walls themselves. Here's a small, slightly tragic detail. Some of these workers were organized into early guilds or collegia, a kind of club for tradesmen. These groups provided insurance, mutual support, and sometimes a tiny bit of political voice. Still, the work didn't make anyone rich, and mortality rates were high. Falling into an open drain, inhaling toxic gases, or catching infections from sewage was not uncommon. And then there were the night crews. Rome didn't have modern streetlights. After dark, workers had to patrol the streets, clean, and sometimes guide people safely across cobblestones, slick with rain or waste. Torches were carried, but the smell, darkness, and occasional bandit made the night shift a little terrifying. Not that it stopped them. Rome had a city to run, and someone had to do it. It's worth noting the irony here. Rome prided itself on public hygiene, aqueducts, fountains, and baths. Citizens flaunted clean hands, scented oils, and perfumed togas. But every bit of that cleanliness relied on the unseen, dirty, dangerous work of ordinary people scraping filth from streets and drains. The city gleamed because the laborers sweated in its shadow, and unlike other Roman occupations we've covered, street cleaners and sewer workers were mostly nameless. We have records of laws concerning their duties and wages, but rarely personal names. They were crucial, invisible, and enduring, the backbone of urban life. Once the sun rose, their work was done until tomorrow. Because in Rome, life and filth moved at the same relentless pace, and from the streets, the sand, and the sewers, we can drift naturally into another urban oddity: Rome's lamplighters and torchbearers. Without them, the city would have been dark, dangerous, and much less dramatic. Even with the sun blazing over the Forum, the city of Rome had corners that were dim, narrow, and a little bit treacherous. At night, streets and public spaces needed illumination, not for spectacle like the Colosseum, but for simple survival. Enter the lamplighters and torchbearers. The job was straightforward in theory: light the oil lamps lining public spaces, hold torches for nighttime travelers, and keep flames alive until dawn. But in practice, a little more complicated. The lamps were small, clay or bronze vessels filled with oil, often olive oil, with a wick carefully trimmed to avoid smoke or flickering. Oil was expensive. Flames were fickle. One careless gust of wind or spilled jar of oil could snuff out an entire block of light. Torchbearers were the more mobile version of lamplighters. They walked streets, guided officials, or accompanied travelers. Their torches were hefty bundles of resin-soaked wood, dripping sticky tar. Imagine trudging through narrow alleyways, smoke stinging your eyes, ash raining down, carrying a torch heavier than your dinner plate. And yes, occasionally, a torch would sputter or burn a hand. Safety gear, non-existent. Nighttime Rome was dangerous in other ways too. Street cleaners had finished their early sweeps, but thieves, pickpockets, and occasionally wild animals could lurk in shadows. Torchbearers sometimes doubled as guides, warning travelers, or helping officials navigate dark streets. Their presence offered some security, but mostly it just made them noticeable targets, a glowing beacon in the darkness. These workers were usually slaves or low-paid citizens, often tied to a collegium, an ancient kind of trade guild that organized their labor. Their hours were long, their tasks monotonous, and their recognition minimal. No one celebrated the people who kept the oil lamps burning while senators slept in their domus. And yet, Rome without them would have been pitch black, chaotic, and probably a bit deadlier. Interestingly, some torchbearers were called upon for ceremonial duties. Processions, religious festivals, and public rituals required someone to carry the sacred flame. In these moments, the laborers briefly became participants in civic life, although they still returned to the streets afterward. Their hands smelled of tar, and their robes carried smoke marks, but for a short while, they were part of the spectacle rather than the invisible machinery behind it. It's easy to forget, but lighting Rome was more than aesthetics. It was a form of public safety, navigation, and order. Without them, the city's night was a minefield, and like many of the occupations we've explored, the job came with a curious mixture of necessity, danger, and invisibility. From these flickering lights, we can naturally drift into another corner of Roman life, where visibility, status, and danger intersected. The professional mourners who attended funerals kept order in the streets during processions, and sometimes even enhanced the theatricality of death itself. Rome, for all its baths, arenas, and bustling streets, had a complicated relationship with death. It wasn't something hidden away. It was performed, ritualized, and very, very public. And as with almost everything in Rome, There were specialized jobs for the people who made it all happen. The professional mourners, or prefect. These women, usually employed by the family of the deceased, had a very specific role: make grief visible, audible, and dramatic. They wailed, tore at their hair, beat their breasts, and sometimes fainted strategically, all to demonstrate the depth of loss. The louder the lament, the more prestigious the funeral. It was a bit of theater disguised as mourning. And yes, some families hired multiple mourners to make the occasion feel truly epic. Their work wasn't just emotional labor, it was also physically exhausting. Hours of loud crying, gesturing, and moving through crowded streets left bodies sore and voices hoarse. And unlike actors in a play, they weren't safe on a stage. They walked behind carts carrying the deceased, often in weather that was hot, dusty, or rainy. Their dedication made the grief feel real, even if it was highly performative. Interestingly, their presence also had social and political value. A funeral in Rome was as much about legacy as mourning. Senators, magistrates, and wealthy citizens wanted to display status through the scale of their funerals. Professional mourners helped turn death into a public statement. In this way, the prefecti were essential to Rome's social theater, invisible in history, but highly visible at the time. Other funeral-related jobs included torchbearers, a recurring role we've seen in the streets, and sextons or gravediggers, who prepared the burial site. Some of these workers doubled as undertakers, coordinating the procession, arranging flowers, or even ensuring that the deceased's body was properly washed, dressed, and presented. Like most of Rome's laborers, they were essential, yet largely unsuspected. And then there were the mourning coaches and litter carriers, usually slaves, who transported the deceased, and sometimes the grieving family, through the streets. They had to maneuver carefully, avoiding crowds, stray animals, and the occasional street performer, all while keeping the procession orderly and dignified. A misstep could turn a solemn event into chaos, but it was their job to remain composed, even if the sun beat down and the roads were slick with dust and mud. The role of professional mourners also had an interesting cultural side effect. By exaggerating grief, they shaped how Romans viewed death itself. The wails and cries became expected, almost performative norms. Without these mourners, funerals might have seemed subdued, quiet, and socially unsatisfying. In other words, they taught Rome how to mourn with volume, flair, and endurance. So, from the arena to the baths, the streets to the funerals, Rome's city life was built on a foundation of invisible, often exhausting labor. People who were crucial to public life rarely appear in history books, but without them, the spectacle of Rome, all the baths, processions, and spectacles we think of as Roman civilization, simply wouldn't have existed. Next, we can drift gently from the mournful streets to the quiet, meticulous world of scribes and record keepers, those who preserved Rome's bureaucracy, taxes, and correspondence, because someone had to make sense of all the chaos. When we think of Rome, we usually picture grand architecture, emperors in togas, and blood-soaked arenas. Rarely do we picture someone hunched over a wax tablet, stylus in hand, trying not to smudge the ink while calculating taxes or copying official decrees. And yet, these scribes and record keepers were crucial to the empire's functioning, the invisible glue holding everything together. Scribes worked in tabularia, offices that were often small, cramped rooms filled with scrolls, ink, and wax tablets. Their primary duty was writing contracts, census records, tax rolls, court documents, and correspondence between magistrates or governors. It might sound mundane, but imagine keeping track of a city of 1 million people without spreadsheets. That's what they did, by hand, every day. The materials themselves demanded skill. Ink could smudge, wax tablets could warp, and scrolls could tear. Scribes had to write carefully, consistently, and legibly. One error could mean a tax collector miscalculates a levy, or a legal case goes awry. Rome had no CTRL plus Z. Mistakes were permanent, and often very embarrassing. Interestingly, being a scribe wasn't always lost. Educated men might serve as scribes in administrative positions, earning modest respect, and sometimes moving into more prestigious government roles. But most scribes were slaves or freedmen. They spent their days in near silence, punctuated only by the occasional grumble from a client, or the scratching of a stylus on wax. One particularly fascinating role was the actuarius, a scribe who specialized in military correspondence. These men recorded troop movements, supply orders, and official reports from the frontiers. A poorly written letter could delay reinforcements, misdirect supplies, or confuse an entire legion. So, while they were behind desks, they indirectly influenced the fate of battles. And then there were record keepers for public ceremonies and festivals. These scribes documented who participated, what sacrifices were offered, and how much wine or grain was consumed. It sounds tedious, and it was, but these records ensured accountability and continuity. Festivals were expensive, and the scribes' notes prevented embezzlement and political scandals. Some scribes also became involved in legal cases, drafting petitions, complaints, or contracts. They had to understand legal language, formulas, and phrasing. A misworded clause could render a contract void, and the scribes often bore the blame. Not exactly a forgiving career. Despite the quiet, meticulous nature of the work, scribes were the backbone of Roman administration. Without them, taxes would be chaotic, military orders would be lost, and city life might collapse into disorder. They were the invisible architects, building the empire not with bricks, but with words and records. And like many of the other invisible workers we've explored, scribes often went unnamed. Their labor was crucial, yet history rarely remembers them individually. They left behind the evidence of their work, but not themselves. Their names, faces, and personalities were swallowed by the very bureaucracy they maintained. From these quiet rooms filled with scrolls, we can drift naturally into another form of labor that shaped Rome but is rarely discussed. The dyers and launderers who made sure the city smelled relatively clean and the citizens looked respectable in their togas. Rome, for all its grandeur and marble, had one inescapable problem: humans get dirty. The streets were dusty, the baths were crowded, and everyone wore togas, which, let's be honest, are not the easiest garments to keep clean. That's where the fullers, dyers, and launderers came in, the unsung heroes of Roman hygiene and fashion. Fullers were essentially ancient dry cleaners, but messier. They cleaned, thickened, and softened woolen garments using water, clay, and sometimes urine. Yes, urine. Turns out, ammonia is an effective cleaning agent. Fullers worked in tubs or vats, stomping on cloth with bare feet, kneading in cleansing agents, and then rinsing. It was hot, wet, and perpetually pungent work. Imagine standing in a shallow pool of warm water with the occasional chemical bite in your nose, sloshing robes for hours. Not glamorous, but the togas of senators and magistrates depended on it. Once garments were cleaned, dyers took over. Color mattered in Rome. Purple was for the elite, red for certain officials, and other hues signaled social rank or profession. Dyers worked with plant extracts, minerals, and insects to create vibrant colors, often in small, smoky workshops. Their work was tedious and dangerous. Many pigments were toxic, requiring constant care. If a dyer spilled a vat of purple dye, it could ruin a client's social standing. No pressure. Then came the launderers, who completed the process, washing and drying garments for everyday citizens. Launderers often operated near rivers or public fountains, scrubbing clothes on stones or using large vats, then hanging them to dry in the sun. Their labor was physically demanding, repetitive, and like fullers, sometimes smelly. But without them, even the middle classes would have walked around in dingy, odoriferous robes, and public appearances would have been embarrassing. Some workshops combined all three functions. A single establishment might wash, dye, and finish clothes for multiple clients, catering to both the wealthy and middle-class Romans. These trades were essential to public life. Appearances mattered, hygiene mattered, and the Romans were very conscious of both. Interestingly, these workers were often organized into collegia, like the scribes or torchbearers. Fullers' guilds regulated prices, quality, and apprenticeship. Dyers trained young apprentices for years to ensure skill passed down. Launderers often took pride in speed, efficiency, and even creative folding. In a way, these laborers preserved Roman social order. Clean clothes equaled respectability, dyed colors equaled status, and efficiency equaled survival in a competitive market. And like all the jobs we've explored, their labor was largely invisible to the casual observer. Citizens enjoyed bright, clean togas without ever thinking about the hours of scraping, washing, stomping, and chemical handling that went into them. Without these trades, Roman society would have been far less elegant, far less colorful, and far more smelly. From the streets, baths, scribal offices, and workshops, we can drift next into the less glamorous but fascinating world of animal handlers and butchers, the people who kept the city fed, entertained, and supplied with meat for both daily meals and ceremonial sacrifices. Rome, for all its sophistication, had a simple requirement: people needed to eat, and lots of them. Feeding a city of hundreds of thousands, maybe a million at its peak, required a sprawling network of animal handlers, butchers, and meat vendors, all working quietly behind the scenes, so citizens could enjoy sausages, roasted pork, or the occasional exotic dish. Animal handlers were responsible for procuring, transporting, and managing livestock. They worked with sheep, pigs, goats, and cattle, sometimes even exotic animals like camels or elephants for special events. Their job involved feeding, cleaning, and controlling animals during transport to markets or amphitheaters. It was physically demanding, smelly, and, depending on the season, dangerously hot. A kicked pig or spooked ox could injure a handler instantly. No insurance, no safety net. Once at the market, butchers took over. Butchery in Rome was both a skilled craft and a public spectacle. Slaughtering animals required precision, knowledge of anatomy, and a steady hand. Unlike modern butchers working behind glass, Roman butchers were often out in the open, displaying cuts of meat for customers to inspect. They trimmed, cleaned, and portioned meat while maintaining hygiene as much as possible in a city without modern sanitation. Interestingly, butchers were organized into guilds or collegia, like many other trades. These groups regulated prices, supervised apprentices, and enforced standards. Apprenticeships could last years, teaching the nuances of cutting, curing, and even simple preservation techniques using salt or smoke. Butchers also supplied meat for temples and public festivals, ensuring that religious sacrifices were carried out correctly. A poorly handled animal could offend the gods, or at least make priests grumble. Some butchers specialized in game or exotic meats, supplying emperors, senators, or wealthy patrons. These workers sometimes had closer connections to elite households, earning higher pay and social recognition. Yet most were ordinary city laborers, anonymous in records, enduring the stench, the blood, and the physical strain for their daily wage. And then there were slaughterhouse assistants and market porters, who moved carcasses, cleaned blood-soaked floors, and maintained tools. These jobs were even lower status, often performed by slaves or freedmen, and they carried a high risk of injury. Yet without them, the markets would collapse, and Rome's population would starve. Animal handlers and butchers also played a role in entertainment, particularly for the amphitheater. Gladiatorial games, beast hunts, and ceremonial spectacles required animals, sometimes dozens at a time, and the logistics of moving and caring for them fell on these workers. Their labor ensured that Rome could watch lions, tigers, and bears parade across the arena floor while senators clapped from their seats. In short, while citizens enjoyed meals, festivals, and spectacles, the backbone of this abundance was invisible: people enduring smell, danger, and hard labor. Without them, the city's social and cultural life would have ground to a halt. From the smell of slaughterhouses and markets, we can drift gently into the quieter, yet oddly intimate world of Roman innkeepers, tavern keepers, and food vendors who sustained everyday city life with cooked meals, wine, and gossip. Rome's streets were crowded, noisy, and dusty, and not everyone had a domus or a kitchen to call their own. For the ordinary citizen, the traveler, or the occasional senator who overslept, the city relied on a network of innkeepers, tavern keepers, and food vendors, people who kept the city fed, watered, and socially engaged. Innkeepers managed small, sometimes cramped spaces where travelers could rest for the night. Rooms were basic, often with straw mats or simple wooden beds. Inns varied widely. A wealthy merchant might find a clean room with a candle on a stand, while others might be packed with dozens of strangers snoring and coughing in close quarters. Inns were noisy, smelly, and always in motion. The owner had to maintain order, keep food and drink available, and sometimes mediate disputes between drunken guests. Tavern keepers ran smaller, livelier spaces. Taverns were social hubs, places where citizens gathered to eat, drink, and gossip. Wine was sold by the jug, sometimes diluted to stretch supply, and simple meals like bread, cheese, and salted fish were served. Taverns also functioned as informal bulletin boards. Information, rumors, and even political news spread here. Keeping the tavern running smoothly required constant attention, brewing, cooking, cleaning, and monitoring the often rowdy crowd. Street food vendors complemented inns and taverns, selling quick bites like olives, roasted nuts, sausages, and pastries. They often worked from small stalls or carried baskets, calling out their goods to passers-by. Their trade demanded endurance, standing for hours, in sun or rain, shouting above street noise, and constantly replenishing their stock. Like other workers we've discussed, their labor was largely invisible to the wealthy, yet crucial for daily life. Interestingly, many of these food-related professions were run by freedmen or women. Women could own taverns and inns, often inherited or operated by family, and they could earn a modest, respectable living. The work was never glamorous, but it offered social visibility in ways other labor did not. Regular customers, word of mouth, reputation, and occasional interactions with elite clientele. Food safety, naturally, was a concern. Poor storage, spoilt ingredients, or contaminated water could lead to illness, but Rome had no inspectors in the modern sense. Vendors relied on experience, tradition, and customer trust. Repeat business meant careful handling. A bad reputation could sink a small stall or inn quickly. And as with other trades, guilds and collegia existed to protect interests. Innkeepers' associations could standardize prices, mediate disputes, or negotiate with authorities over licenses or taxes. This organized, collaborative aspect of trade is a recurring theme in Rome. Workers relied on each other as much as on their labor to survive in a sprawling, complex city. Ultimately, these innkeepers, tavern keepers, and food vendors made urban life possible. Without them, the streets would be quiet, empty, and far less navigable. Their labor sustained both the body and social life of the city, a quiet, understated backbone of Roman civilization. From the smell of taverns and roasting bread, we can drift next into the city's performers, entertainers, and musicians, who added sound, rhythm, and sometimes distraction to everyday life. Rome wasn't silent, not even close. Between the shouting of market vendors, the clip-clop of horses, and the clamor of carts on stone streets, there was another layer of sound: the music, acrobatics, and performances provided by street entertainers, musicians, and actors. These people added rhythm, humor, and spectacle to daily urban life, often for coins tossed into a hat or a small fee. Street performers were a mixed bag. Some juggled, tumbled, or performed daring acrobatics. Others recited poetry, sang, or played instruments like the lyre, flute, or double pipe. Their work required skill, stamina, and nerves of steel. A fall from a juggling trick, a misplayed note, or a misjudged crowd could end the performance in embarrassment, or worse, injury. Yet, despite the physical and social risk, performers were a constant presence in plazas, near baths, and outside theaters. Musicians, in particular, held a unique role. Their music accompanied dances, religious rituals, market announcements, and personal celebrations. Skilled musicians could earn regular patronage from wealthier citizens, while less talented individuals eked out a living on the streets. Music was more than entertainment. It structured the rhythm of the city, signaling moments of festivity, devotion, or social gathering. Actors, meanwhile, often performed in temporary outdoor stages or during festivals. Comedy, tragedy, and mime were popular forms, and actors frequently relied on masks, costumes, and exaggerated gestures to reach a crowded audience. Their profession was precarious, dependent on the whims of the public, the generosity of patrons, and the timing of festivals. Some actors became famous or infamous, yet most remained anonymous, their names lost to history. Interestingly, many performers were slaves or freedmen. The profession offered a small amount of mobility. A talented performer could earn freedom, gifts, or social connections otherwise unavailable. Yet, the trade also carried social stigma. Performers were admired and scorned simultaneously, valued for skill but not always respected for character or status. Street entertainers also played a crucial role during religious festivals, triumphs, and public ceremonies. Their dances, songs, and acrobatics punctuated civic life, ensuring that the city's routine was punctuated with moments of spectacle. It was a way for citizens to experience joy, distraction, and community, all facilitated by workers who were largely invisible behind the performance itself. And of course, like many trades we've seen, Performers sometimes organized into collegia, associations that regulated apprenticeship, performance rights, and disputes over space or payment. These networks provided some security in a profession that was otherwise precarious and unpredictable. Without performers, Rome would have been quieter, less colorful, and socially flatter. Music, dance, and spectacle added texture to life, subtle but essential. And just as with scribes, launderers, or torchbearers, these entertainers were rarely remembered individually, though their work echoed through the streets and plazas of the empire. From the lively chaos of music and performance, we can drift next into the city's educational laborers, tutors, grammatici, and rhetoricians, who shaped minds quietly behind closed doors while the streets hummed outside. Education in Rome was not universal, but for those who could afford it, it was a carefully staged performance of learning, hierarchy, and labor. Behind every well-read youth, there was a tutor, grammaticus, or rhetorician, quietly shaping minds while the city thrummed outside. The earliest teachers, often Greek slaves or freedmen, served as tutors for young boys in patrician families. They taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and of course, moral lessons. Their classrooms were modest, a private room in a domus, a shaded courtyard, or sometimes a rented space. Their work required patience, discipline, and a sharp eye for errors, because a poorly educated child could reflect badly on the family. Once boys reached adolescence, the grammaticus entered the scene. These teachers specialized in literature, poetry, and language. Students read Homer, Virgil, and other canonical texts aloud, analyzing grammar, style, and rhetoric. The grammaticus had to correct mispronunciations, enforce memorization, and nurture a sense of cultural literacy. Mistakes were met with admonition or mild corporal punishment, the Roman version of try harder or face the rod. For older students, particularly those aspiring to public office, the rhetor was the final stage. The rhetor taught persuasion, argumentation, and the art of speech-making. Pupils delivered speeches, debated, and practiced legal arguments, all under careful supervision. The job required patience, tact, and the ability to sculpt confidence in teenagers prone to laziness, distraction, or sudden boredom. Interestingly, these educators were often slaves or freedmen, experts in their field, but socially subordinated. Yet their labor was prestigious in some ways, shaping the next generation of politicians. Magistrates and civic leaders granted them a subtle influence on Rome's governance. They rarely appeared in public records, but their fingerprints were all over the city's elite. Education was also hierarchical and gendered. Wealthy girls might receive instruction at home, focusing on reading, writing, and household management, but rarely rhetoric or advanced literature. Tutors for girls were often female, emphasizing moral education, etiquette, and domestic skills. These educators played an equally vital, though quieter role in sustaining Rome's social structures. Like many professions we've explored, teaching was organized informally. Tutors might network, exchange techniques, or apprentice under more experienced educators. Their labor required consistency, intellectual precision, and a careful balance of encouragement and authority. A misstep could leave a child ill-prepared for social, political, or familial expectations. Ultimately, these educators maintained the intellectual scaffolding of Roman society. They were invisible in the public eye, but essential to the culture of civic participation, social etiquette, and literary achievement. Without them, Rome's elites would be illiterate, unpersuasive, and, frankly, much less interesting in their political squabbles. From the quiet, disciplined study rooms, we can drift next into the physically demanding labor of construction workers, stonemasons, and aqueduct builders, the people whose toil literally shaped the city's architecture and infrastructure. Rome did not build itself. Those grand temples, sprawling forums, and meandering aqueducts required armies of laborers, often anonymous and always indispensable. Construction workers, stonemasons, and aqueduct builders formed the backbone of urban expansion and monumental architecture. Without them, Rome would be little more than dusty streets and wooden shacks. The work was physically exhausting. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, and transported, often with crude tools and simple machines like pulleys and cranes powered by human or animal muscle. Scaffolding was timber-based, uneven, and risky. Workers spent hours lifting, hauling, and chiseling, their bodies perpetually sore, hands blistered, and clothing dusty. Accidents were common. A falling block, a snapped rope, or a misjudged lift could maim a laborer permanently. Stonemasons required both strength and skill. Carving inscriptions, statues, and structural blocks demanded precision. A poorly carved block could compromise the stability of a building or disrupt the aesthetic flow. Some masons were highly respected for their craftsmanship, yet most remained faceless in history, their work admired while their names were forgotten. Aqueduct builders faced a different challenge: engineering. Water had to flow across miles of uneven terrain with a gentle, consistent slope. Channels, arches, and bridges had to be carefully aligned. Workers labored under the sun, in rain, or even in semi-submerged conditions. It was dangerous, exhausting, and required constant supervision, yet it provided the city with clean water, a basic necessity that defined urban life. Many laborers were slaves or freedmen, though occasionally skilled artisans earned wages. Their labor was repetitive, grueling, and rarely glamorous. Yet without them, Rome would not have had public baths, fountains, or the architectural grandeur that inspires awe centuries later. Interestingly, construction labor also had a seasonal rhythm. Heavy work often paused during intense summer heat or the rainy season. Workers' schedules were structured around sunlight, climate, and the availability of materials. Even in downtime, laborers remained on call. Rome's projects never truly stopped. Guild-like organizations sometimes existed, grouping masons, carpenters, or other specialists to coordinate labor, standardize techniques, and manage apprentices. These networks provided a semblance of order in otherwise chaotic and physically demanding work environments. From the sun-baked quarries and scaffolds, we can drift next into the quiet and meticulous labor of Roman craftsmen and artisans, whose jewelry, pottery, and household items brought beauty, utility, and status into daily life. While construction workers moved mountains and shaped buildings, craftsmen and artisans added nuance, beauty, and utility to Roman life. Without them, the city would have been functional but dreary, lacking the small luxuries and decorations that enriched daily existence. Potters worked in noisy workshops, spinning wheels and molding clay into vessels, amphorae, and decorative objects. Their labor was precise. The thickness of a vessel, the smoothness of its surface, and the clarity of painted motifs determined whether it would sell or shatter. Potters often worked in family groups, passing knowledge through generations, and their products were essential for storing, cooking, and transporting food, wine, and oil. Metal workers, particularly jewelers, labored over gold, silver, and bronze to produce rings, earrings, brooches, and decorative objects. Their work was meticulous and delicate, requiring steady hands, sharp tools, and constant attention to detail. A misstep could ruin a precious piece or even injure the artisan. Yet their work defined social status. Jewelry signaled wealth, rank, and taste. Artisans were thus quietly influential, shaping perceptions through objects rather than words or laws. Leatherworkers and shoemakers also played vital roles. Roman sandals, boots, and belts required hand-cut leather, careful stitching, and attention to fit and durability. Shoes were functional, but in elite households, they could also be decorative, adorned with dyed leather or metal accents. Artisans ensured that citizens, from slaves to senators, could walk the city streets without stumbling, literally and socially. Glassblowers produced vessels, lamps, and small decorative items. The work required mastery of temperature, airflow, and timing. Glass objects were delicate, often imported or copied from Mediterranean designs, and served both practical and aesthetic functions. A well-made lamp or bowl could become a centerpiece in a home, highlighting the artisan's skill while elevating the household's prestige. Craftsmen also often organized into collegia, forming networks of support, apprenticeship, and regulation. These groups ensured consistent quality, resolved disputes, and maintained trade secrets. Apprenticeships could last years, teaching subtle techniques that defined an artisan's skill. Many artisans were freedmen or slaves, their labor shaping society, while their personal histories remained largely invisible. Interestingly, artisans sometimes worked for the state, producing standardized items for public ceremonies, temples, or military use. Coins, ceremonial vessels, and decorative architectural elements were products of their expertise. Their labor intersected with the public, even if their identities were mostly unknown. From the intimate workshops and family-run studios, we can drift next into the hidden world of Roman cleaners, street sweepers, and sanitation workers who quietly maintained order, hygiene, and the flow of daily life. Rome was a city of stone, marble, and bustling crowds, but it was also, well, messy. Streets were dusty, markets were littered, and waste accumulated faster than anyone could reasonably manage. That's where cleaners, street sweepers, and sanitation workers came in, the invisible hands keeping the city functional and livable. Street sweepers, often slaves or freedmen, worked from sunrise to sunset, sweeping dirt, dust, and debris into heaps for removal. Their tools were simple: brooms, baskets, and shovels. Their labor was physically demanding, repetitive, and rarely appreciated. Passers-by seldom noticed them. Yet the difference between a clear street and a filthy one affected commerce, social interaction, and even public health. Waste disposal was another crucial task. Workers collected trash, night soil, and refuse from households and markets. This often involved carrying heavy baskets through crowded streets or transporting waste to designated dumps outside the city walls. The work was dirty, smelly, and socially stigmatized. Yet without it, Rome would have quickly become uninhabitable. Public latrines and baths also relied on specialized laborers. Water had to flow consistently, drains had to be cleared, and communal spaces had to be cleaned regularly. These workers ensured that citizens could bathe, relieve themselves, and socialize without constant disease or obstruction. Their labor, though silent and unnoticed, structured the rhythms of daily life in subtle but critical ways. Interestingly, some sanitation work was ritualized. Certain streets or neighborhoods might have dedicated cleaning days, or workers assigned specific routes. Religious festivals, market days, and public gatherings intensified the need for cleaning, giving sanitation workers occasional moments of recognition, though still far from public fame. Like other laborers we've discussed, these workers sometimes organized into collegia. Membership provided protection, shared resources, and negotiated pay or working conditions. It also offered a small amount of social cohesion in otherwise low-status work. Despite their invisibility, these networks gave workers a collective voice. However limited, in maintaining Rome's daily life, their labor also intersected with public health. Removing waste reduced vermin, curbed odors, and prevented the spread of disease. In a city with hundreds of thousands of residents, sanitation workers were quietly preventing catastrophe every day, an unsung, heroic labor. From the alleys and latrines, we can drift next into the world of Roman couriers, messengers, and scribes tasked with communication, who maintained the city's social, administrative, and political connections.